What's up everyone, my name is Rosendo, welcome back to my channel, and we are back with another breakdown video. Today we are looking at Express, the second track in my discography. If you saw my last video, you know this is technically the third, but the second track where I have my sound, where I'm dealing with a lot of supersaws, a lot of big elements. So this is going to be really exciting, right? We got Express, a drum and bass track if you haven't heard it. If you haven't heard it, go check it out on all platforms. And we're going to hop into FL Studio and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the track and we're going to break it down. So let's get straight to it. Now real quick, this is me after I recorded this video. I just want to make a quick side note and say this is a pretty long video. I'm actually surprised on how long it was because Exposition had a lot more intention and Express had less intention but more expression, as I'll talk about in a second. And it ended up being really long. So as I've done in my previous videos and as I'll do in this one, I'm trying to be really specific on timestamps. That way, if you see an area that you might not be so interested in, you can skip around. You can kind of know what's going on at what point in time. But yeah, I actually thought Express was going to be one of the videos that would be a little bit longer because it's definitely not as intentional as Exposition is and as a lot of other tracks are. But I ended up talking quite a bit about some of the decisions I made in this track and some of the things I really like about this track. So again, you can check the timestamps to hop around a little bit, but I hope you enjoy it. There's going to be a lot to unpack here and a lot to learn hopefully as well if you're a new producer, if you're just looking for some inspiration. So thanks for watching, and now let's get to it. Alright, we are back in FL Studio taking a look at Express, a drum and bass track where we have quite a bit of pattern similar to what we did last time, and we're looking at 51 mixer tracks. I believe Exposition ended around 60, 64 maybe. Express has a lot less, not a lot less, but about 50, which is again right around the time where I was averaging. I think 50 mixer tracks is a pretty good estimate for where my tracks normally end up. I would say ended up. Right now they're going a little bit longer as I'm getting better at producing. But in any case, here we are. We're taking a look at it. You can see right off the bat, off the sides, you have some synths, some atmospheres, basses, big leads, a lot of lead layers actually, and very little effects. You actually have a riser here. But other than that, not a lot of noise actually now that I'm looking at it. Exposition had a lot more noise than this. I do believe my next track, Progress, has a lot more effects. But not a lot going on for Express. So before we get into this track, naturally, I'm going to talk about why I made this track and why I named it Express, actually, because music with intention, right? And actually, here's one of the things about intention. Intention can come in several different ways. And there was a while where I actually said expression was another one of my signature characteristics because of this track. But I almost slightly take it back, not because I don't like expression, but more so because I think expression is a kind of a form of intention. So it kind of captures, it kind of falls under the first category. And that being said, with my signature characteristics, I really do try to make sure they apply to every single track I make in one way or another. And expression definitely applies in most tracks I make. I would say up to this point, probably all of them I make. But if the track does have expression, it kind of falls under the intention. Expression is the intention. So right now, I wouldn't really say expression is a signature characteristic, although it is definitely a characteristic of most of my tracks. But again, it falls under intention, which was the intention of this track right here. So why did I make this track? Two reasons. Number one, I like drum and bass tracks. I like drum and bass, so I wanted to make a drum and bass track. And furthermore, I didn't just want to make a drum and bass track, but I really like kind of these melodic and big synth heavy drum and bass tracks that there aren't really a lot out there. And don't get me wrong, I love aggressive drum and bass. I listen to a little bit of Liquid. I really like dance floor drum and bass, and I love those tracks. I love that genre. But I also really like melodic drum and bass, which I feel is a little bit less represented, which is why I wanted to make this, right? I wanted to take my sound, me as a producer, and make a melodic, emotional drum and bass track. It's not so melodic. It's not so emotional. At the end of the day, it's a drum and bass track with, a lot of energy. It's 174 BPM, as you can see. But I wanted to put my own spin to it. I wanted to make it mine, right? I wanted to make a track that was representative of my sound in the form of drum and bass, I guess you can say. Now that was essentially reason number one, and reason number two is more or less the same, but the difference is expression really was the intention here, because as a producer, again, if you saw my other videos where I made my Fake ID Tech House remix, and then I made Low, where they're kind of, I used the word listenable, and a lot of people can kind of hopefully enjoy them. The same thing was not true about Express, and the same thing was not true about Exposition. And Express is kind of different because it's a drum and bass track, but I really just wanted to take it as something more than that. As you know, I've talked about music as a form of art, and that's really what I was trying to do here, because not a lot of artists are making kind of this type of melodic drum and bass, and it was really my goal to kind of just express that you can make music in any way you want, especially, I mean, not especially, but including something like this, where you have a drum and bass track, 174 BPM, but with these melodic elements, with these emotional elements to some extent, you know, big supersaws, big leads, and all that stuff, right? So that was pretty much my intention there. My intention was just to express the sound that I like in the form of drum and bass. That was really what I was going for. So again, this track is all about expression. When I wanted to name the track, it was really hard to name. I went through a bunch of kind of words that I was messing around with, but ultimately express really just captured what I was trying to kind of go for, because what I was trying to go for is kind of like here. It was almost like a, here it is, here's some, you know, here's my sound, here's some sound, here's some music that really represents who I am, but I like drum and bass, so here it is in the form of drum and bass, right? You don't just have to make aggressive or dance floor or liquid drum and bass, but you know, here's what I want to do, and here's what I can do, here's how I express myself. In a completely different way, because I express myself in exposition. I would actually say I express myself really well. But I can express myself in other ways, such as through drum and bass, because I like drum and bass, and I like aggressive drum and bass, you know, and dance floor drum and bass, but I also like emotional and melodic songs. So why not combine, you know, drum and bass and emotional melodic songs? And here it is, me expressing that through this track. All right, now I'll try not to ramble too long before we get into the actual breakdown, but there are two things that I wanted to kind of highlight before we started, because it's actually important. Now, I talked about one of them already on TikTok through short form videos, and there's one of the other things that I didn't mention, but I want to talk about how this track was created. And actually, if you saw, I believe, my low breakdown, I mentioned that I find it really hard to start tracks just from scratch without any form of inspiration or nothing to build off of. And here I actually had two very important things, not important, but very foundational things to build off of. So let's talk about how I started this track, because it really means a lot to me. You know, it's really what I started with and how I ended with this project file you see right here, which, I mean, 46 hours. We'll talk about mixing in a bit. We'll probably talk about that before the breakdown starts. And yeah, wow, that's actually really long. That's beside the point. So there's two things that I started with this track that were pretty much the foundation of this track. Now, number one, if you look behind me, you'll see a keyboard. I dabble with the keyboard. I know how to play it, but that doesn't mean I can play it well, right? I know the scales, I know the chords, but, you know, I can't really, you know, look at sheet music or even look at, you know, the labels of the chords and, you know, play them really well. But I can make melodies. I know how it works, and I know the scales and all that stuff. I know intervals. So I'm not the best at it. I would actually say I'm not really good at it at all, but it's there for me to use when I want to. Now, that being said, let's take a look at FL Studio. This is one of the first tracks. This is actually the first track I made where I started on the keyboard and then liked what I did and translated it into my DAW. This is actually the chord progression I started with. And one of the reasons I really like this is because whenever you think of chord progressions, I mean, these aren't even chords, these are intervals. But whenever I think about starting a track with chord progressions, or even when I'm on the keyboard, I think about, triads, mostly triads, maybe messing around with the seventh, maybe messing around with even inversions and things like that. But this right here just felt so right to me. I was thinking, you know what, just two keys and just go by feel here, just get something that feels good. And even these intervals are slightly untraditional. I mean, this is what, a whole step right here. This is another whole step. We're running with some really weird intervals, but because I just liked how they sounded, and sometimes you'll hear people say that there are no rules in music production, and there are no rules in music production. And I just liked how it sounded. They're strange intervals. I mean, the F sharp key is pretty much in all of them except for the first one. I just rolled with it. So let's take a look over here. So I started by just playing these intervals on their own, and when I liked how it sounded, I decided that I would use this as my chord progression, and that's really how the track was born. Now, the second thing that served as a foundation for this track, I'll mention a little bit right now, but I'll break down more when we talk about these leads. It actually has to do with the variation in rhythm. You'll notice right now that you'll see some of these leads are sustained and some of them are plucked and broken up. I actually made a video on this already as well about breaking up these these leads and making a really interesting pattern on top of sustained leads, which I've also mentioned I really like. So that was kind of the second inspiration for this track, where when I got to these leads, I really wanted to have some fun there and make things interesting in a very, very subtle way. If you listen to the track, you can actually pick it out if you're really, really careful. But I'll talk about more of this in a second. But those were the two foundations for this track that ultimately kind of led to the rest of it. And let's talk about mixing before we get into the track breakdown. Now, I mentioned in exposition that I had very little practice mixing and that my mixing skills we're going to use the word mediocre. They were pretty mediocre, and the same thing is true with this track. And when we break down Progress, we'll talk a lot about mixing because the intention in Progress was a lot of the intention there was actually mixing. But in this track, I mean, it's pretty, again, the mixing skills are pretty mediocre. You have a lot more leads than you had in exposition. The bass is mixed, I hope well. We'll have to get into that. A lot more drums, so that's nice. And a lot less synths. So, I mean, the leads can get really harsh and they can get really hard to listen to. It's not the worst thing in the world, but you'll definitely notice that as we're breaking down the track. And actually, if you've heard the track and you have an ear for these types of things, or even if you don't, maybe you still think the leads are a little bit harsh. But in any case, the mixing, again, as I mentioned in exposition, probably could be better. I don't want you to worry too much about the mixing that we're going to get into here because, again, I'm not talking about what I could have done better. I'm just talking about what I did. But again, as we go on, you might notice the leads are a little bit harsh, but that's all right. All that will get improved, I would say, significantly in Progress. So stay tuned for the next breakdown video. All right, now without further ado, let's get into it because this track starts with the intro, like all tracks do. But this track starts with an intro, ride, tambourine, main bass, and should be this chord progression that we mentioned earlier with a really nice atmosphere. So take a listen to this. This pretty much sets the mood for the entire track. Again, I'm going to be talking over most of these in case you haven't heard the track already. This pretty much sets the atmosphere for the entire track, and automatically it feels a little bit almost angelic, but it sets a nice mood, a nice vibe for the intro. Plus, these tambourines shimmer really well, and let's get to it. All right, so you hear that shimmer from the tambourine, you get the rhythm right off the bat. I love rides. I'm a huge fan of rides. But the bass, really low bass. Is this a Reese as well? It is not a Reese, but pretty low, and it gets a nice vibe as well with the atmosphere. And as you heard just now, these drums are gonna get filtered up with some noise right here. I guess filtered down. Yeah, these drums are start filtered, and then they're going to get the filter is going to turn off. Let's go back a little bit because you hear the shimmer, chords, and then drums come in. Right, yeah, establish that drum and bass rhythm right off the bat. Filters are going away, noise is coming up, especially that bass as well. And that's the intro. Super standard intro, but I'm actually a really big fan of this intro. I really like it. It sets the mood and the tone just perfectly right away. I mean, again, as I mentioned a few times already, the shimmer from the hi-hats is there, the rhythm from the rides, and the emotion from the pads, and kind of the mood and the atmosphere from the pads is there, and the bass is there already. Then we go into the drum and bass drums. They're filtered, but you hear them coming in, and everything is just kind of growing until you get to this moment right here, where everything is all here now. Maybe not everything, the leads aren't here. But you got the chords, and I mentioned last time that I'm a fan of these kind of sustained moments in the exposition breakdown. This isn't really a sustained moment, as I mentioned before, but it's a moment that I'll have in most of my tracks. Drums go away if the drums were there already. In exposition they were, and release they are. Progress is kind of different. But we're looking at exposition, progress, and if you've heard release, where you pretty much start with the drums, and then you take them away to have the track, have its moment, to allow the listener to listen to what's going on, adapt to the environment, to the atmosphere, and really set the mood for what the track is not only going to sound like, but what it's going to feel like. What does the track feel like? That's very important. In any case, piano and synth play huge roles here. Another synth with some melodies over here. And again, I mentioned how names can be somewhat arbitrary. I struggled, I didn't really struggle, but I wanted to really commit to just the 2-chord intervals for the tracks, but adding these harmonies just made such a big difference. Adding, thirds and bass notes made such a big difference. So some of these will be triads, some of these will just be intervals, which is why this is labeled synth melody, because if I do remember correctly, this should be different. This is the atmosphere you heard earlier, which should be different to the synth melody pattern that is right here. Right, you'll notice that these are different intervals, which is one of the nice things, right? Because I was working just with intervals, and this is actually an important part of the track, because I was working with just intervals, I kind of had free creativity to experiment with different notes on different patterns. And that's one of the things I really like to do. And that's one of the advantages I think electronic music really has that I think more producers should be taking advantage of, is because you can essentially have, we're not going to use the word infinite, but you can essentially have infinite instruments and synths all doing whatever you want at the same time. Why not have one pad right here? Let's take a listen to this melody. Why not have one pad, although it's more of a synth, playing something different to a different melody, to a different atmosphere, sorry. When you can do all these things and you can really switch things up. Even here, you're looking at this pattern right here, and on the piano, we should be following the bass notes. Yeah, so we're following the bass notes and getting those intervals right there, but something you're not getting on, not only on the atmosphere, but on what you heard earlier. You didn't hear these at all over here, although you should have heard, yeah, this bass pattern should have been there. But you're not really getting those triads in, you know, I would say in different ways, not only through the piano and actually this synth right here, which also looks like it's following a unique pattern. So awesome. But not only the piano, which has all these notes, I believe we're actually going to need to take a closer look at this. And you'll notice that there's actually no triads on the piano right here either. Yeah, I'm looking at this closely. I don't see any triads. It's all intervals here, obviously with an extra bass note. And same with the synth, right? It's all intervals. So the triads really come from using the synth melody to add the extra note, which I think is awesome. So again, the intervals really stayed as the foundation of the track, and that extra stuff, the extra harmonies, literally, were added through a whole other synth, which is only really playing right here. And then obviously I change it a little bit, and I add more triads and all that stuff over here. Before the intro, all you get is this atmosphere right here with the bass playing, which, let's take a look. They do have the same notes. That is a G, D, E, D. Also somewhat untraditional bass progression, but we're going to talk about why that works well, at least in my opinion, why it works well once we get to the drop. But in any case, again, you really just have those intervals playing, and that extra harmony is added through this synth melody. We're just going to call this synth melody because it's labeled that. Through this, which I think is awesome. Anyways, you get some melodies going in here. Let's take a listen to this now. Right, intervals plus the synth melody. And then you hear that pluck for the first time with some nice noise right here. That Impact does a good job. And ride comes back. Tambourine comes back. And then the melody takes a little bit of a detour here, which is nice. Take a listen to this because we're going straight down, which is what you'll hear in the drop. And here we kind of double up with a little bit of a passing tone. So it switches things up nicely. And now we've reached the build-up. Anyways, let's get to the build-up here because this is where the lead kicks in. So let's take a listen. Bass gets dropped. And now we have a lot of elements here. Melody still stays there. And let's talk about this in a bit. But most importantly, you have a few things actually. Number one, kick for the build-up. Number two, a bass and a new rolling bass now. And you'll notice that the sidechain is slightly enabled. So there's some sidechain on it. I mean, you'll notice right here actually, you get actually a 1/8 sidechain, which I like doing. We're going to talk about this in a bit. But you have the bass and a new bass pattern. You have these synths right here, which actually have a pretty hard sidechain on it as well. We're going to take a listen to all of it in a bit. And of course, you have these leads. Now, if you listen to everything together, let's really take the drop for everything all at once because the build up, because you go from here, bass comes in, you hear the kick, you hear the sidechain, and this pluck comes back in. Occasional plucks here and there to reinforce certain parts and to keep that mood, the nice plucky mood there. Down, down, back up. New kind of pattern here that is distinct to the lead. And then you go into the drop. Now this buildup isn't anything crazy, but there's a lot of really small things in here that I always like to do that really make every part of the track feel different to one another. Let's talk about that. I've already talked about it a little bit. Number one, take a look at this bass line because I've mentioned before, I love sidechain, and the more I can mess around with sidechain, usually the better. So you hear this. Standard, I believe 1/4 sidechain on there, which is pretty fast for a drum and bass track because we're at 174 BPM. And then you switch it up. You hear that right there? You go from this 1/4 sidechain, which is, let's say, 25% activated, maybe even 33% activated. And then you switch it up for a 1/8 sidechain, which, let's open up both of these so you can see exactly what's going on here. Right, so this one is off right now. And then it takes over. So it's a 1/8 sidechain with a, well, it's a 1/4 sidechain with the 1/8 thrown in there, and maybe you'll hear a little bit more over here. Hear the difference there? So I always like to mess around with sidechain as much as I can. I have a lot of fun, but again, it's these little elements that make the track interesting to listen to. Just like with the pluck, where the pluck you have, again, pretty different melody to what you had earlier. Even this melody is kind of something I just had some fun with and really experimented with, because if the lead does all the carrying of, let's say, literally the lead, it's the lead, the melody is just there to reinforce things and also add a little bit of variety, because the lead follows a very simple pattern the entire time, right? It's going down. We're going to talk about this in the drop. It's going straight down. But the melody here, it jumps around. It goes from place to place, and it really makes it does a good job of keeping things interesting. And when I talked about defining a mood, defining kind of the vibe, the pluck is also there to introduce that kind of almost angelic feeling that you don't get out of a lot of drum and bass tracks. So it's all about expression. This is actually in the drop, but right here we're listening to this, right? Even the lead, even the melody follows the same progression as the lead, but it's split up a little bit differently. Plus, with a passing tone, it keeps things really interesting. Anyways, a few noise effects for the buildup. Sorry, that was not the buildup. The buildup is right here. So yes, anyways, a few noise effects for the buildup. The lead comes in, and here we have a layered lead that I kind of doubled up. I struggled with the lead a little bit in this track, and but here you have two layers kind of an octave apart here to really fill up the space, to make sure we have enough space in the buildup for the lead. Sorry, it's taking up enough space and it doesn't feel thin. But it doesn't take up too much space that it sounds exactly the same in the buildup that it does in the drop. I mean, you'll see here that there are two layers for the lead and the buildup, although one of them is an octave apart. So there's essentially, let's say, three. Well, there's two layers, but there's three sounds going on. And here in the drop, we have a lot more. Anyways, let's take a listen to the drop. EQ right here. And actually, on this snare buildup that you'll hear right here, the snare buildup, before I forget, the snare buildup is actually different, and it's a little bit different over here as well. But because the kick is pretty standard, right, just every half beat right here, the snare buildup changes the rhythm. Bum, 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 bum. And then it goes into a normal buildup, and again, it introduces some really good variety. With a few drum fills here, this is back when I didn't have a lot of samples, and I wasn't really using splice. Actually, it didn't even have splice. So I kind of messed around with some snares to almost make a pre-drop fill right here. So snares plus a tom fill that I got out of one of the sample packs I did have. Plus, again, as I mentioned, a change in melodies here, where you get one hit and then two hits in one beat right here. So that is the build up into, let's go straight into the drop. I'm going to talk over this again, but again, you hear everything hit all at once. Main bass, a square bass, a mid bass, and a sub bass. Probably too many layers, but again, as I mentioned in my exposition breakdown, I'm not going to talk about what I could have done. I'm going to talk about what I did do. Piano and synth do all the work there. All these lead layers, you might, even right now, I can hear that harshness quite a bit, so you might be able to hear that harshness there. And then the melody comes in, following the same pattern as the lead, which will change later, with an extra added rhythm right there. So let's break down all these elements at a time. You got the drums, pretty standard drum and bass pattern. Kick, snare, plus a ride and a tambourine. So not a lot of elements going on there. Hopefully some of these are panned. Good, I panned. Oh, I did not. So So not a lot going on there, but just enough elements to you know, make things interesting. Even hold up. Actually, I remember doing this because if you listen to this track, you can actually hear this extra tambourine hit right there for variety, which we haven't gotten to yet, but it's just there for variety. So it's mostly pretty standard, but I threw in this on accident and then kept it there, which you'll hear in a bit. So those are the drums. Anyways, pretty standard. Not even sent to a bus. So again, practically no mixing. Just sidechain whenever necessary. Probably just to the synths and to the basses, maybe even the lead. I'm not gonna check that. Basses. Somewhat muddy, but again, pretty much all in mono, even this mid bass. But let's take a listen. Main drone. Same bass you heard earlier, maybe with a little bit more EQ. You get the mid. We're going to talk about this rhythm in a bit. You get a sub and a square bass for some reason. I do remember making this track and adding a square bass because I felt it needed to fill in a little bit more space in the bass. I'm sure if I mixed it properly, I wouldn't have needed this. But this is there, and it does a really good job of taking, kind of filling in the bass and making it mix well with the whole track. So it definitely adds a lot more lows. I'm sure, again, if I mixed everything properly and did not do something like this, I wouldn't have needed it. But it does what it needs to do. And you have the leads. I'm not going to talk over this. Take a listen to these. I mean, you can kind of see what I'm about to break down, but take a listen to these and see if you can tell anything about the leads. See if you can pick anything interesting out about them. So the second foundational part of this track was this variation in rhythm that you have in these leads. Let's take a listen to them one at a time. Let's start with this main 1/4 here. This is the main lead that you hear throughout the track. And right off the bat, you can probably see and maybe even hear it. Because if you take a listen to the whole drop as a whole, maybe you hear a little bit more now, but you might think that the leads are all sustained and they look something like this. Or maybe even something like this. Let's do the main bass. Or something like this. You might think it sounds something like that, but actually it does, but also it doesn't, because there's more than just one rhythm going on there. And this is something I mentioned that I broke down in a different TikTok video, where this is kind of the main rhythm, not the main rhythm, but the rhythm that you really hear, because, well, technically it is the main rhythm. It's kind of swallowed by by the sustained sound, especially when you're dealing with kicks and basses and synths and all this other stuff. And that was intentional because I wanted it to be super, super subtle. I really only wanted people to be able to pick it out if they tried, if they really wanted to, if they were paying attention and they were really trying to give it a sincere listen. So let's listen to two of them at once. Let's listen to this main one, and let's listen to this lower lead, because that does a good job of separating the rhythms. We're actually going to take a listen to a different one, because the main lead is a little bit too loud compared to other ones, naturally. So you can't really quite pick out the rhythm. So take a listen to this. You hear this pluck kind of getting that rhythm going. I'll even solo it, because you can really hear that rhythm there compared to, let's say, this. Let's mute this melody. This is purely sustained. Has some sidechain, so it sounds like it's getting that 1/4 hit, but in general, it's sustained. So with the kind of combination of all of these, you get some really distinct rhythms, where this is what the other foundational principle of this track was, a variation in rhythm, which is why you actually see right here I have two mains. I was messing around with having the same sound, one kind of rhythm, one not rhythm, and then they're both sent to this bus. It didn't really work out, and I ended up just doing it with layers, so that's why you see this, and that's why you see this muted main rhythmic right here. But in general, with the layers, you get exactly what I was looking for, which is you get that variation in rhythm. Again, pay close attention, and you should be able to hear it now. And speaking of variation in rhythm, you have these basses as well. You could probably hear it earlier, because when we're soloing these, it's very clear. But take a listen to this main, which is sustained. with the mid bass. Very different rhythms. And this does a really good job of introducing another variation rhythm that it's similar to the leads, but it's not the exact same. So there's some really good variation going on. Let's listen to everything one more time before we move on. But that was pretty much what was going on in the drop. It was, actually there's one more thing, but let's listen to this all one more time so you can really listen for that variation. Anyways, last thing I wanted to mention, which is something that might seem kind of clear and not really all that important, but is pretty intentional, is about the actual movement of the melodies and the chords. I mentioned earlier that these melodies just go straight down, right? Straight down the scale, while the intervals also do a little bit of movement, right? They go up, down, even though these two are exactly the same. And I mentioned as well as the bass that it goes one note down, E, D. So two chords, two notes that are the same. Very kind of untraditional bass progression there. But everything was intentional, especially when you consider the movement of everything in general. And this is something that I really like when tracks do, and something that I really like including in my tracks as well, is that difference in movement, right? So the leads are going straight down and the bass is going kind of down, up. And all things considered, this is essentially, I believe, I'll have to double check, but all things considered, I believe this is actually a 1-5-6-4 track, just with different bass notes. Let's take a listen to this piano, because this is actually the other thing I forgot to mention. When we were just messing around with intervals here, we just had the intervals on the piano, but then you change it to actually have the chords and all of them, and you actually even get this rhythm in the piano. And this actually doesn't quite have the triads. I was pretty confident. It might just be the synth. The synth is where I add the triads in. So the piano stays with the intervals. It appears, yeah. So the piano stays with the intervals, but in the drop, the synth actually changes because we do lose the synth melody here. So we need the harmonies there in one way or another, which is where the synth comes in. Not only the leads, but the synth comes in to establish those harmonies. So let's listen to this, right? Let's not listen to this, but let's take a look at this. GDA, DAF, so just standard D, EBF, and DAF, so another D, right? Now, the one thing I really like about these is these chords aren't traditional chords. Sorry, these two, I'll say, aren't traditional chords that you get in most tracks. I mean, especially with this whole step right here for the intervals. So, I mean, it just felt right. This is not something I would normally do, or something that I don't think I've done up to this point, and maybe haven't done again. I've messed around with some untraditional chords up to this point. But I mean, just having these intervals where you have a whole step as the chord I think is awesome, and it just felt right. It sounded right, and I stuck with it. So, but back to that movement that I was talking about, you have the so it's not a 1-5-6-4, but you have the bass line going, well, let's talk notes. G, D, E, D, but essentially, let's say up here, down here, a little bit up, back down to the second note. And you have the synths doing something pretty similar. And you have the leads doing something not completely different, but you have the leads just going straight down. So again, when it comes to EDM and even something with a lot of instruments, you have the ability to make everything so different and sound different and move differently that I think it's one thing a lot of producers should take advantage of. Again, bass going here, down, up, down, lead going straight down, and it adds a really interesting kind of element and sound to the track that, I'll be honest, I think it's subjective to me. This is something that I really like, and it's not something that I think a lot of producers need to include. But this is a sound I really like, and this is probably one of my favorite ways in my tracks that I can represent it through something like this. Bass line moving one way, leads moving another way, and specifically straight down. I like when things move straight down a scale. So this is a really good representation of that. All right, let's move past the drop into this kind of post drop where you get this variation I talked about. Listen. Extra tambourine hit, nothing crazy, but I think it adds a nice little flair to it. So drums stay, then they get taken away while the tambourine and the ride stays. You actually get a reverse ride right here. But more importantly, you get some weird changes in the sub where you hear the kickstart. This is actually on the bass bus. So you hear the kickstart drop and essentially turn into a 1/2 with some synths that are still there. We got a new synth in a bit, but it's mainly this movement and this reverse ride and the changes in the sidechain on the bass that lead naturally into the next track. if you saw the low breakdown video, pretty similar to that, where after that drop, you kind of go straight into something else. So let's take a listen to that. So pretty good transition. Again, tambourine gets taken away, and the ride gets split into every beat. Sorry, every other beat with the reverse ride. Into this, again, we call them verses, verse 2. Same drums that you had in the drop. And again, something I mentioned before that I will do all the time. First verse, no drums. Second verse, drums. Pretty great way to add some progression. And one of my favorite ways to make sure the track stays moving forward, as I've probably mentioned a dozen times now. But let's take a listen, because you'll notice right off the bat, different bass rhythm really changes things quite a bit. You go from this main bass, the kind of the standard bass you had over here, right here, let's do this, into this bass. And this should be thirds, this should be 1/3, I just don't want to get it wrong. So you got thirds on the bass line. New synth over here. Let's take a listen to that on its own. So just add some extra higher elements to the whole track. You actually can hear it quite a bit. But anyways, drums are here. Track keeps moving forward, new bass line rhythm, and then we get some hi-hats and the ride comes back in to add some more movement. Gets taken away, kickstart gets half dropped, drums get dropped, 1/3 gets dropped. So movement there is really nice, super intentional, where you get a ton of rhythm right here, even more rhythm right here, especially with the bass, and then it all gets taken away, gives the track some space into another buildup. Now this buildup is pretty similar to the first, except we don't have this melody over here, so it's really all the elements that you're hearing again, because you heard them over here in the drop, so you're getting all these elements again. You'll hear quite a bit of a difference in the snare buildup. Other than that, without this melody, the buildup still feels different to how it felt before, and the changes in the snare buildup that you get in a second. Other than that, same elements, they're all brought back so you can hear them one more time before the drop. And then right here, snare buildup is a little bit different. Let's solo that. Right here, you get something like this. So a little bit more spacious, more room in between each hit. The big difference is kind of in this first half of the buildup, you actually get more hits right here. Let's mute this. Bum, 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 bum. And then we keep moving forward. So the buildup is pretty similar, just with that changes in the snare, and of course without the melody, you just have the elements themselves, which I believe is something pretty similar I did to Exposition, where you kind of have all those elements, except you take away some of that synth, some of the synth you heard earlier, where in Exposition, the synth on the first buildup is, let's say, half cut off on the filter, and on the second buildup, it's almost entirely cut off. It's just all the other elements that are there, and then the synth kind of loosens up a little bit and gets introduced. Anyways, let's move forward, because you have here, this fill is actually a little bit different. So you'll notice that there's a few more hits there. Other than that, it should be pretty similar. So more of an introduction here. Now the drop should start the same, I believe, and the difference is going to be in the latter half of the drop. I just want to confirm because it should be the same here. But this is where you get to have fun with these melodies again, because earlier you had the standard movement in the pluck and this melody that follows exactly how the leads follow, sorry. Basically a hit every 4 beats. And because I talk so much about variation and changing things, this is another area where you do exactly that. You take the melody that was following the lead earlier, and you kind of make it its own melody. Let's solo this. So you really play around with it and have some fun and introduce a whole new melody, which I also like when tracks do, right? When you take that second drop and you pretty much introduce a whole new melody. I mean, a good example is a lot of times when artists will throw in a new instrument with a new melody in the second half of the drop. The first example that comes to mind is actually an example I really like. Around the World by Kashmir, where you have a pretty standard first drop, and on the second drop he adds that saxophone that adds a whole lot of movement. Now the saxophone is a whole other thing. It's presumably a live instrument, and it has a ton of movement, and it's played really well. But the premise is the same, right? Where the first drop is pretty standard. You have the elements, you have a melody, but on the second drop you have the exact same thing you had, plus an extra melody on top, in the form of a new instrument. In this case, it is not a new instrument. It is what you heard earlier, but it's still a new melody, completely distinct to the first one. Again, here it is. And with these higher notes, it reinforces that almost angelic, emotional, I might even use the word happy, or joyful kind of a feeling you had earlier, especially on something like a drum and bass track, which isn't really a feeling or an emotion you get really all that often on drum and bass tracks. That was kind of the intention there, is to really make this feel like, again, like expression, like you're getting something that you wouldn't normally get, that this is my sound, this is something that I want people to feel on what would normally be, at least the songs I listen to, an aggressive and bass heavy genre, which again, I love. But when I'm making my own tracks, I get to have the freedom to express myself how I want. And this is how I decided to express myself. Now let's take a listen to that melody in the context of the drop. Let's go a little bit further back. Right here. So with that drum and bass pattern and a new melody, same thing, mid pattern from earlier on the bass. Extra hit for this outro where everything is there but the melody gets dropped, and it kind of just brings you back to bass, back to home, where after the melody's gone, you get the exact same thing you had earlier, but it just feels a little bit different. And actually, it goes down a little bit because some of the leads get dropped. So instead of going from this full thing, it brings you back a little bit more close to home. So you can tell it's going down. This gets dropped. Drums get dropped. These extra basses get dropped, and you're kind of making your way down for the outro. So again, melody goes away, some leads go away, and it just gets smaller and smaller. And not necessarily even smaller, but I think I described it really well. It almost gets closer to like a home bass that you were reaching earlier when you had, this sound. And once everything gets dropped, you're kind of relaxing a little bit. Leads get dropped, basses are still there. More leads get dropped, basses are gone, drums get dropped. And naturally, to really reinforce that transition and that movement, it goes from a ride every beat to every other beat. And outro with the drums. I like this outro with the drums, right? You get the ride back to really hit mid bass. The main bass actually turns into the different third bass that we had earlier right here. But everything's pretty much gone. You just get this atmosphere again, right? Leads are gone, bass is mostly gone, synths are gone, and the star of the show is this atmosphere right here. And that is the outro. So again, you get kind of this build-up here. It's almost like an extended mix to some extent because the track doesn't just end, but it has drums on the outro. But the movement is there. I mean, you go from the main bass, things get filtered slowly as you see right here. Things get filtered slowly as you see right here. Even the bass gets filtered right here in a bit. This bass actually gets high passed over here, so we have less of the subs. And these drums get filtered as well. This atmosphere is still there, again, doing its job. And everything kind of is going away slowly. And the drums hit. You get this, a third pattern gets taken away. You go back into the sustain, which does a really good job of closing everything out. Filtered kick hitting. And that is the end. I do believe this is short, and I hope I didn't export it like that. That should not have been there. Yeah, I'm pretty confident that wasn't there. So listen to that one more time, because that kind of killed the momentum we had going for the outro, where you have these drums, they get filtered, you get back to the sustain bass, the drums build up a little bit, and the track ends. All right, and that was Express. I don't really think there's much more I want to break down here. I mean, the sound design isn't anything crazy, as I mentioned before, and I pretty much took a listen to everything on its own during the drop breakdown. These effects, you heard there's not that many, but if not, you can see them right here. A little bit of noise in the intro, these noise, kind of atmosphere noises that I really like to use. Some risers, not that many, honestly. I get a little bit more creative with risers, not necessarily creative, but I definitely use them more often in my future tracks. Progress definitely has quite a bit of risers, which adds to the movement a lot. And other than that, this is pretty much it, right? The main takeaways here are, let's say 3. Number 1, well, actually, there's probably a million takeaways, so I'll try to go through this quickly. Number 1, expression, right? Drum and bass track with some emotional. So number 1, expression. I was looking to make a track that was almost melodic, emotional, we can even say angelic, in a genre that isn't really like that at all, especially when I'm such a big fan of aggressive drum and bass. That was kind of what I was going for. Express yourself, right? Express your sound, express something you want to feel, express an emotion. That's number 1. Number 2, interesting chord progressions, right? Everything was made with intervals, so kind of some untraditional things going on there. Number 3, a variation in rhythm. So you had this is a big one. You had the main leads that were chopped up in a really interesting way with some sustained leads and a sustained bass and a kind of a mid bass playing a completely distinct rhythm. So that was number 3. And number 4, just the changes in the variation in direction. As I mentioned before, bass going here, 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 and the lead going straight down. All add some really interesting movement to the track. And of course, as always, I'm always big on progression, intention, and movement. So those are always there as well. And that pretty much wraps it up. Thank you guys for watching. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll be happy to answer them. Another breakdown video is coming soon. Next up in my discography, we have Progress, where the mixing gets a lot better. So I'm excited to break that one down. And you also have its intention in its own way. But other than that, I hope you enjoyed the track, right? Let me know if you have any questions or comments. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.